Hello and welcome to the presentation on feminism and the ethics of care. As you've probably noticed, we have swapped the order of virtue ethics and the feminist ethics of care reading. There are a few reasons for this. Rachel's order does make sense. His way of doing things emphasizes the fact that virtue ethics is a theory that is well poised to take into account personal relationships. Since, as we will see, the ethics of care criticizes traditional ethical theories which focus on universal principles and instead favors a focus on personal relationships, a discussion of the ethics of care does lead nicely into the theory of virtue ethics. I, however, chose to present virtue ethics to you first. I did this for a few reasons. First, because I discussed the fact that there are three dominating theories of ethics right now. These are utilitarianism, Kant's deontology, and virtue ethics. I therefore felt that it was good to keep these three grouped together. Secondly, because these three theories are the subject of your essay, having them all presented to you earlier gives you more time to practice thinking from the perspective of each of these theories in the forums. If I covered virtue ethics in this module instead, then students would be practicing virtue ethics during the same week they would be expected to write their essays. Of course, if you're in the 8-week course, you do 2 modules a week, so in that case there may be no avoiding this. 8-week courses move twice as fast. Also, it should be noted that while doing this module, you are probably also working on your essay. You should spend most of your time this week on that essay. Material in this module will appear on the objective part of the test, but there is no independent quiz on it, and it will be emphasized less on the test than other sections. This is because this section is less theory-dense than other sections. Instead, we are spending a good deal of the time raising issues and bringing questions to light. This is not because feminist ethics is small. Courses could be taught on it. But delving into the specific individual theories and subtle distinctions between them would be a bit more advanced, isn't covered in the book, and of course wouldn't give you the extra time in this module to work on your essays. One issue we will be discussing in this lecture is the issue of whether or not there is a special feminine ethic. We'll be asking if traditional ethical theories are designed for male psychology and whether there is a mode of ethical thinking more congenial to the psychology of women. It is worth noting that not all feminists share the same perspective. Feminism is largely broken up into several waves, sometimes 3 waves in post-feminism and sometimes 4 waves. While not everybody agrees on exactly how to describe the values of each of these waves, here's the general picture. Wave 1 feminism is seen as beginning in the late 1800s and ending in the early 1900s. This wave focused on the women's suffrage movement. Suffrage is the right to vote. The women in this wave challenged more than just this, of course, but women's suffrage was a huge issue during this period, as well as a breakthrough. Wave 2 feminism. This is usually thought of as beginning in the 1960s. There was a large focus on reproductive rights and constitutional equality regardless of sex. Wave 3 feminism. This wave focused a good deal on sexuality and sexual empowerment and often challenged female heterosexuality. Wave 3 is of special interest to us here because third wave feminism, and I am quoting from Wikipedia here, their article is quite good, contains internal debates between difference feminists who believe that there are important differences between the sexes and those who believe that there are no inherent differences between the sexes and contend that gender roles are due to social conditioning. So again, there are large differences between feminist perspectives. After this, there's standpoint feminism and post-feminism. You are not going to be tested on the different waves of feminist movement, and the boundaries between these waves are not always clear. Social movements are messy, and the people within them do not all believe the same thing. Such movements are usually composed of factions. I bring up the waves of feminism here primarily to emphasize the point that some feminists emphasize the difference between the sexes and some do just the opposite. It would be a mistake to walk away from this chapter, therefore, and think feminists say that women are fundamentally different from men ethically, because this is just one subset of feminist thinking in much the same way that Catholics represent just one subset of Christian thinking and Protestants another. Though they both identify as Christians and share many views in common, one group believes in transubstantiation and the other does not. For those who don't know, transubstantiation is the view that wine and wafer literally, not figuratively, become the blood and body of Christ during communion. The psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg developed the so-called stages of moral development by asking children of various ages to respond to moral dilemmas. These children were then interviewed at regular intervals for the next 20 years. He then noted the differences in their responses. Some responses tended to only appear later in life, and some were universal or near universal early on. His conclusion was that we develop morally as we age. He broke this moral development down into 6 stages. These are as listed in Rachel's. Stage 1, obeying authority and avoiding punishment. Stage 2, satisfying one's own desires and letting others do the same. Stage 3, cultivating one's relationships and performing the duties appropriate to one's social role. Stage 4, obeying and maintaining the welfare of the group. Stage 5, upholding the basic rights and values of one's society. And Stage 6, abiding by abstract universal moral principles. It is worth noting that it isn't the case that the majority of people later in life fell into Category 6. Indeed, Kohlberg believed that very few people ever make it to Stage 5. The stages are ordered in this way because the higher numbered responses tended to come from those who were older. Thus, very small children can only morally reason in terms of obeying authority and fear of being punished. Older people often tended to special relationships and saw themselves as having special duties given their particular roles. Uncommon and generally only present among older individuals were those who could reason using concepts of basic rights, societal value, or abstract universal moral principles. Rachel describes Heinz's dilemma, which was one of the moral scenarios the children were asked to evaluate. In this scenario, Heinz's wife is dying and needs a drug to survive. The pharmacist who discovered the drug is selling it for $2,000, even though it only costs $200 to make. Heinz can only raise half this, but the pharmacist will not sell it to him for half price. Nor will the pharmacist allow Heinz to pay half now and owe him the rest. The children were asked to then evaluate whether it would be wrong for Heinz to steal the drug under these circumstances. Of course, we know that thought experiments do not need to be realistic to make a salient philosophical point, but this one unfortunately is realistic. This guy, Martin Shkreli, raised the price of Daraprim by 4,000%, from $13.50 a pill to $750 a pill. Rachel's contrasts the responses of a boy named Jake with a girl named Amy. Jake, obviously an unusual boy since he seems to be reasoning at one of the stages Kohlberg believes that few statistically reach, gives his reasoning. He says, a human life is worth more than money. Universal principle. The druggist will still make money selling the drug for $1,000, and he can still live with the reduced profit, while Heinz's wife will die without the drug. When asked why a life is worth more than money, Jake says the druggist can get $1,000 from rich people, but Heinz can't get his wife again. When pressed again for his reasoning, Jake points out that people are all different. So Jake here seems to be considering universal principles, or perhaps the values of society, that a life is worth more than money. He also seems to be considering general welfare. Amy, on the other hand, says that Heinz shouldn't steal the money. She says, I think there might be other ways besides stealing it, like if he can borrow the money or make a loan or something, but he really shouldn't steal the drug. But his wife shouldn't die either. If he stole the drug, he might save his wife then, but if he did, he might have to go to jail, and then his wife might get sicker again, and he couldn't get more of the drug, and it might not be good. So they really should just talk it out and find some other way to make the money. Regardless of further prodding, Amy would not alter her answer. By Kohlberg's reckoning, Jake is operating at level 5 or 6, while Amy is stuck at level 3, cultivating relationships and performing social duties. Based on his observations, he believed that girls failed to get past level 3 much more often than boys. One of the objections to Kohlberg's hierarchy that Rachel points out has to do with his developmental assumption. Remember how the hierarchy was created. Kohlberg placed some responses at a higher level because they tended to emerge later in life. But this carries with it the built-in assumption that these later ways of thinking about ethics represent moral progress. What do you think of this objection? On the one hand, Kohlberg's work clearly does have this built in as a premise. This premise can definitely be questioned. On the other, it might not be a wild assumption. We might have at least some reasons to believe that people tend to get better at particular things as they develop. In terms of ethics, we do know that areas of the brain associated with moral reasoning continue to develop a great deal in childhood and even continue on into one's 20s. Nevertheless, and this wasn't really discussed in Rachel's, other studies have shown that responses to these types of questions are culturally sensitive. That is to say that the answers vary from culture to culture and therefore are not purely the result of development. But the main feminist criticism is the claim that Kohlberg's view has a male bias and that Amy's moral reasoning is not inferior to Jake's. This view is to accept that these methods of moral reasoning are different, and to point out that Jake's view focuses on abstract principles and Amy's focuses on personal relationships and caring. Men have dominated philosophy historically, and so have dominated ethics. Thus, a male perspective on morality has dominated ethics. This male perspective, it is argued, emphasizes abstract principles, so it is no surprise that they are often seen by philosophers as superior, and that the female perspective has been neglected. A female perspective emphasizes personal relationships and caring. If we look at what Amy had to say, her thought process was not simple. She considers many possibilities that Jake does not. Jake's view generalizes into universally applicable principles, but Amy expands on the story of Heinz the pharmacist and his wife. The male view zooms outward to the less personal and the abstract, and the female view zooms inward to the more personal. Gilligan argues that Amy's view is not inferior to Jake's. Rachel doesn't mention it, but in Gilligan's book, A Different Voice, she discusses 3 levels of female moral development. In the first level, women overemphasize self-interest. In the second, they overemphasize the interest of others. In the third, the morally ideal woman balances the two. How differently do men and women really think? Even if one believes that men and women differ in moral reasoning, it is important not to overemphasize the differences between men and women in this regard. Men and women are of 2 different genders, not 2 different species. We are alike in more ways than we differ. This includes psychologically and morally. Even physically, men and women have little sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism refers to physical differences between the genders within a species. If men and women differ in their moral evaluations, they likely only do so by a small degree. Saying that men reason like Jake and women reason like Amy would be a disservice, even if one granted that there were biological differences behind moral reasoning. Jake's reasoning represents one sort of paradigm case, and Amy's another kind of paradigm case. In reality, when both men and women reason about everyday moral issues, they are both concerned with principles and with personal relationships, with abstract impartiality and caring. And often these views are at war within us. It is philosophers who tend to evaluate and rank these things and say which ones should be more important. A recent study by the Society for Personality and Social Psychology found that one reason for differences in moral judgments between men and women was that women have a stronger emotional reaction to harmful actions, but that there was no evidence for gender differences in the rational evaluation of outcomes of harmful actions. So again, while noting that the differences are not huge, there have been some statistical psychological differences found between the way men and women reason morally. How much of this is biological and how much of this is cultural is not always easy to determine, and how well this is controlled for depends upon the study. Here is a list of some of the differences that have been noted. Psychology Today's webpage had a nice compilation of a variety of studies as part of a meta-study, and so what I am presenting here is text directly quoted from that page. Some studies show that women are more empathetic than men, and that this difference increases over child development. When looking at pictures of immoral acts, women's judgment of severity correlate with higher levels of activation in emotion centers of the brain, suggesting concern for victims, whereas men show higher activation in areas that might involve the deployment of principles. When men watch wrongdoers getting punished, there is activation in the reward centers of the brains, whereas women's brains show activation in pain centers, suggesting that they feel empathy for suffering even when it is deserved. Women are more likely to factor personal costs into decisions about whether to punish an unfair stranger, which suggests that women are more context sensitive and men adhere to principles. Women are twice as generous in a game that involved dividing $10 with a stranger. Numerous studies have found that women are more likely than men to reciprocate acts of kindness. Women tend to be more egalitarian than men, and men more likely to be either completely selfless or selfish. Women are more likely than men to think it is okay to imprison a person on trumped-up charges in order to stop violent rioting in the streets. Women are more likely than men to blame a shipwrecked survivor for pushing another survivor off a small plank of driftwood in order to survive. Women are less likely than men to be politically conservative, though the reverse pattern was true in the 1950s. The fact that the last item has reversed since the 50s is especially interesting, as it suggests that some of these traits are highly malleable by culture, even if there are some underlying physiological differences. In spite of the fact that these studies say that men focus more on punishment, the same web article notes the following. Female judges are tough on violent crime. In a study of about 200 Pennsylvania trial judges, Felissa Kuntz found that female judges are more than twice as likely as male judges to find a male defendant guilty of assault, and they impose longer sentences. Male judges' personal injury awards were more than twice as large as female judges, though female judges awarded 3 times the damages for assault. This page also notes this, which I will quote since it's relevant to Rachel's own citations. This range of findings resists an easy summary, but on the whole, women seem to be more empathetic and more focused on the collective good. This is broadly consistent with Gilligan's suggestion that women are more likely than men to base moral decisions on a care orientation, whereas men gravitate towards principles. So there seem to be some statistical differences between the way men and women reason morally, though again we do not want to overstate them. But granting this, we need to ask whether these are psychological or cultural in origin. Evolutionary psychology would suggest there would at least be some physiological component, given that men and women would have different optimal mating strategies for gene fecundity. Long histories of selection within cultural roles may also play a role. As with many things of this nature, there are probably both physiological and psychological or cultural elements, just as there are with political views, childhood behavior, aggression, and so forth. But it is one thing to note that differences exist, and another to know what those differences really tell us. What does all this mean? What should we take away from these differences, and what do they suggest for an ethics of care? Somebody could take up a number of positions regarding this. Such a person could say that we ought to replace existing theories, and that an ethics of care is sufficient as a theory all on its own. Somebody could instead argue that an ethics of care should supplement existing theories. Or alternatively, one could not embrace an ethics of care theory at all. Feminists fall into all 3 of these camps, and Rachel notes that many feminists do not embrace an ethics of care. An ethics of care stresses moral obligations that arise from personal relationships and emphasizes the caring that results from this. On the whole, a theory like this recommends quite different actions from most of the other theories we have seen. For example, both utilitarianism and deontology are going to say that we have duties to help people suffering in the world at large, for example, those starving overseas. They would say this for different reasons. One would say this because helping hungry people would maximize happiness, and the other because it is demanded by the categorical imperative. Other ethical theories, such as social contract theory or even divine command theory, are going to say that we have duties to people we do not have direct relationships with as well. But an ethics of caring focuses on personal relationships, not abstract duties to strangers. We have a duty to help hungry friends, but we have no such duty to help hungry strangers. Because we do not know them, it seems that we should ignore the suffering of strangers. This sounds ironically uncaring, but remember that it does not matter if their need is greater. We have no obligation to them, nor are we engaged in any kind of personal caring relationship with them. Though this isn't discussed in Rachel's, there are also some potential problems with viewing an ethics of care so interpreted as especially congenial to the psychology of women. Remember that when discussing the Psychology Today piece, we noted that women are twice as likely to give money to a stranger as men are. But this runs directly counter to what we just said of an ethics of care. And yet the ethics of care is endorsed in part because it supposedly arises more naturally from the psychology of women, and that traditional ethics has a male bias. Let's look at another example. How does an ethics of care say we should feel about animals? We should care about our pets, but not care about farm animals, lab animals, and so forth. We're not concerned here about whether or not this is a reasonable position regarding animal rights. It may or may not be. The point here is that this position statistically seems to run counter to the statistical differences between men and women. According to the Huffington Post, women compose 79% of vegans in the U.S. Women are also among the most vocal members of the animal rights movement. It might very well be the case then that there is a male bias to ethics historically, but that an ethics of care, or at least this interpretation of an ethics of care, does not fully capture the most significant differences between the way men and women approach ethical deliberation. Just one final note on this. Not all feminists who adopt an ethics of care believe that it stops at personal relationships as previously suggested, and so question the criticisms that an ethics of care is not suitable for wider problems involving strangers. Here is an excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the matter. In Starting at Home, Caring and Social Policy, 2002, Noddings extends the principle of her feminist care ethics into the arena of public policy. In response to those who have criticized feminist care ethics as a fine domestic theory, unable to address moral complexities of wider social issues and policies, Noddings insists that having a robust sense of social justice is predicated on the lessons learned in the private sphere. On her view, if we are to develop truly effective social policies about matters such as homelessness, mental illness, and education, we have much to learn by starting at home, where the origins of care have their roots. Feminist ethics has a lot of facets, and we are not even pretending to explore all of these. The purpose of this section is mostly to let you know that some of these issues exist and what basic or simple versions of an ethics of care look like. I mention these other versions because I do not want to set up straw men. There are multiple versions of care ethics. An alternative view to saying that an ethics of care should be a replacement theory is to view it as a supplemental theory. This would suggest that an ethical theory, in order to be complete, needs universal principles of impartial benevolence, but also needs to take into account the value of special relationships, which implies the morality of being partial to some degree. As Rachel notes, the ethics of caring seems especially appropriate to certain types of relationships. If I go to visit a friend in the hospital out of a sense of duty and not out of love and concern for my friend, we seem to think that something is morally wrong. A parent who cares for his or her child because after a utilitarian calculus of all possible outcomes decides that doing so would objectively produce the most happiness seems to be missing the point. We think that a parent ought to be motivated by love. What is more, it is probably the case that even if one cares about outcomes, being motivated by the outcomes is less likely to get one the outcomes desired than being motivated by genuine love will. Sometimes aiming at a target makes one less likely to hit it. A person who genuinely wants to be your friend and admires the things you do and tells you so is much more likely to endear herself to you than somebody who wants to be your friend because of something you can do for her and therefore deliberately tries to say the things she thinks that you want to hear. The second person is more likely to come off superficial. This is true even if it turns out that both your true friend and the false friend would enjoy and benefit from a favor you could provide. It is worth noting that one of the strengths often attributed to virtue ethics is its ability to take into account the value of personal relationships. Aristotle actually dedicated quite a bit of time and thought to the ethics surrounding friendships, and he felt that they were absolutely essential for a happy life. We did not discuss this in great detail when discussing virtue ethics, largely because Rachel's does not really focus on this aspect of virtue ethics, and because this is a survey course in which we need to discuss many theories. Nevertheless, if you consider many of the virtues of character, many are likely to have to do with maintaining good personal and social relationships, such as honesty, loyalty, patience, and so forth. This may be one reason why virtue ethics has seen a modern revival with updated versions by philosophers such as Philippa Foot. The ethics of care is sometimes even cast as a version of virtue ethics. So, what is the takeaway from all this? Some feminists have argued that there is an ethics of care that better captures female morality. They argue that male morality focuses on universal moral principles and impartiality, and that female morality focuses on personal relationships and caring. In Kohlberg's hierarchy, universal moral principles are higher than personal relationships and social duties. There are some criticisms of this theory. One is that age does not indicate moral advancement. Another criticism is that the answers people give to ethical questions seem to be culturally sensitive. That is to say, they vary to some degree by culture. One of the primary criticisms we are interested in, though, is that Kohlberg's view marginalizes female ways of looking at morality while elevating the male perspective. While it is true that men have dominated Western philosophy, and while it is true that there are studies that show statistical differences between the way men and women answer moral questions, we should not overstate the male and female psychological differences. These are differences of degree, not differences in kind. In addition, the feminist movement does not universally support an ethics of care, either because they think the theory is flawed or because they do not believe that a different ethical strategy is justified. But studies do indicate statistical differences in the way men and women answer moral questions. Does an ethics of care that focuses on personal relationships capture this difference? Studies indicate that in some cases women care more for those with whom they do not have personal relationships with than men do. If we recall, women are more likely to give money to strangers, are more likely to be vegan, and so forth. but the ethics of care does not seem to indicate that these positions would be the natural tendencies of women. This may indicate a more complex and subtle relationship between psychological tendencies and moral values than the theory allows. The primary differences between men and women that do seem to repeatedly show up in studies are differences in levels of empathy, how men respond to punishment, and to some degree, application of rules or principles. Virtue ethics is a theory that does a good job of taking personal relationships into account. If an ethics of care is endorsed, it can be endorsed in at least two ways. It might be endorsed as a full replacement theory. In such cases, it would be a theory all on its own. On one reading of this theory, it suggests that we ignore the suffering of strangers and focus exclusively on those we have relationships with or social connections to. Alternatively, an ethics of care might be endorsed as a supplemental theory. In this case, the position would be that an ethics of care is necessary but not sufficient in itself. And that about wraps it up for this presentation. Until next time.